Hello boys and girls. Today Auntie Katie's going to read Mr. Perfect by Roger Hargreaves. Are you ready? Are you sitting comfy? Mr. Perfect by Roger Hargreaves. It was a perfect summer's day, and on this perfect summer's day, Mr. Perfect was looking even more perfect than usual. He didn't have a hair out of place. It's Mr. Perfect. Mr. Perfect lived in Tip Top Cottage, and on this perfect summer's day, his house was also looking even more perfect than usual. Not a curtain out of place. There's Mr. Perfect's cottage, Tip Top Cottage. Look at the curtains. They look perfect. I suppose you're wondering why Tip Top Cottage was looking so perfect. I shall tell you. It was Mr. Perfect's birthday and he was going to have a party. There was a knock at the door. "Perfect!" cried Mr. Perfect. There he is, looking out of his perfect windows. How very kind of you, he said, when he saw all his guests had brought wonderful looking presents. "Please, do come in, and if no one minds, we'll open the presents later." Nobody minded in the least. Well, almost nobody. Do you see all our friends that we've all met before? There's Mr. Greedy, there's Mr. Clumsy, and there's Mr. Uppity. "What's that?" roared Mr. Uppity. "I don't have any time to waste, you know. You better make sure that we don't get bored today." Do you think that this upset Mr. Perfect? What Mr. Uppity's saying? Of course not. Mr. Perfect had perfect manners, unlike rude Mr. Uppity. "Oh no, my dear Mr. Uppity, we shan't be bored today," he replied. "First of all, we shall dance." There's Mr. Perfect asking everyone to dance, and everybody danced. Even Mr. Uppity. "Can you dance? Are you going to dance today?" But although he danced, Mr. Uppity could not manage a smile. There's Mr. Uppity with his mouth turned down. Everyone else seems to be smiling and having a good time, but at least he's dancing. Unfortunately, Mr. Clumsy, being his usual clumsy self, broke a pile of plates. Do you think this upset Mr. Perfect? Not at all. "Don't worry, Mr. Clumsy," said Mr. Perfect. And, being the perfect person he was, and not in the least bit clumsy, he produced a whole lot more plates. There's Mr. Clumsy breaking all the plates. The plates were made of cardboard. There's the cardboard plates. I think that's wise if you've got Mr. Clumsy at a party, don't you? Then he brought in a cake. It was huge. It looked wonderful. It smelt terrific. There's the cake. And Mr. Greedy thought it tasted delicious. He gobbled up the whole cake in 3 seconds flat. There wasn't a crumb left for anybody else. Do you think this upset Mr. Perfect? There's Mr. Greedy. Not in the least. Being perfect, he had always guessed what would happen. Quickly, he brought out lots of small cakes. There were plenty for everybody, even Mr. Perfect. But as he was not greedy, he only ate one. One cake was just perfect for him. Look at all the little cakes, and he's sharing them with all his friends. There's Mr. Funny. Once everything had been eaten, Mr. Perfect opened his presents. He said as many thank yous as there were presents. Well, not quite. "What about my present?" cried Mr. Mean. There's Mr. Mean. Mr. Mean's parcel was so small that Mr. Perfect had not seen it. Mr. Perfect opened the tiny parcel wrapped in newspaper. "Oh, Mr. Mean," said Mr. Perfect, "you've given me a lump of coal. How kind of you. It's delightful." "If only I'd known I'd given him half a lump," grumbled Mr. Mean. Because Mr. Mean's not very kind, is he? "That's it, I've had enough," cried Mr. Uppity suddenly. "I'm fed up with you, Mr. Perfect. And do you know why? I'll tell you. I have discovered that there's the most enormous, unbearable, exasperating fault with you." "Would you be so kind as to tell me what that might be?" asked Mr. Perfect, as politely as ever. "Don't you understand?" cried Mr. Uppity. "Your fault is—" I wonder what Mr. Perfect's fault is. "Your fault is that you have no faults." That's a bit silly, isn't it? Mr. Perfect by Roger Hargreaves.